Okay, so good afternoon. I'm happy to welcome you to the guest lecture of the School of International Studies, Federalism as a Tool in Conflict Areas. And in particular, I'm very happy also personally to welcome Professor Eva Maria Belzer as our speaker, as our distinguished speaker of this afternoon. Professor Belzer is holding the chair for constitutional and administrative law at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, and also a UNESCO chair in human rights and democracy. So many things which go together also for the topic of today. She's the co-director of the very well-known Institute of Federalism, a Swiss brand, I would dare to say, which is not only dealing with Swiss federalism, but as we will see today, in particular also with comparative issues. And she teaches and publishes in the field of Swiss and comparative constitutional law, federalism, decentralization, globalization, human and minority rights, and democracy, as well as constitution making and conflict resolution, which is very much also related to the topic of today. And in this, she has gathered extensive experience also in consultancy as a Swiss expert in a number of international cooperation and consultancy projects. And as you could read here on the short bio on the invitation, this is very much related to Iraq, the Maldives, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Syria. And these are also probably awarded finally the Federalism Prize of Switzerland in 2019. And I'm actually very happy, as we know each other from a number of conferences and projects, that I have the occasion to introduce her. Welcome, Eva Maria. I just want to say some things on the topic. It's a nice way to put it, I would dare to say, a tool in conflict areas. So it evokes the idea of a toolbox, which is consisting of different elements, and how can you arrive at such an idea to have a toolbox, because you identify elements, you identify them probably by comparison, what has worked in other fields, what didn't work. But of course, we are talking about different contexts. We are also talking necessarily, we will hear this very soon, about different arrangements. And so adaptations are needed. And so the provocative thought you have immediately when imagining a toolbox, that a hammer is not a right tool for everything, for fixing everything, but you might need a screwdriver, you might need, and I would add this in particular as a kind of first provocation also, you might need in particular in the conflict situation when something has been broken or has broken or is broken, sorry, in order to fix this, you need glue. And in particular, after a conflict situation, where can this glue come from? What is very often in a federal system also referred to as a kind of specific federal spirit, as a kind of cohesion, cooperation, and coordination, which is much more difficult because of the greater number of actors to achieve than probably in unitary systems. So these kind of questions, you can of course try to arrive at this with guarantees, but the question afterwards is always trust. So I would like to raise this issue already beforehand, because this is the specific challenge of federal systems in general, but even more specific it is in a post-conflict situation. And on the other hand, if we look at tools, then we have, of course, the very basic idea of federalism in the elements. So I'm not giving a lecture now on federalism, because I'm not supposed to, but I just want to say that, of course, we will talk about the self-government of a community, so the very idea of subsidiarity probably, and put this into the wider context of integration, which is the very brief formula of self-rule and shared rule, which is since 1987 with El-Azhar's definition characterizing federal systems. So without further ado, just to have some first thoughts on this idea of power sharing, which is probably also something Eva Maria will touch upon. I'd like to give the floor to Eva Maria. It will be probably very much about balances, and I'm very curious myself to hear about federalism as a tool in conflict areas. Thank you, Eva Maria. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Jens, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to this lecture. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I mean, in the virtual sense of the term. I have been invited to talk about federalism as a tool of conflict resolution. So this is going to be the topic this afternoon. I have been asked to talk for about 40 minutes, and then there should be time for questions and answers. But if you would like to raise a question in between, please don't hesitate to just unmute yourself and speak up at any moment. So interruptions are welcome. Federalism as a tool of conflict resolution is one of my favorite topics because it tries to solve a very crucial topic of our world. I've tried to picture it on the first slide. We try to find a magic formula which allows people to live together in all their diversity without conflicts getting violent. There will always be conflict. So when we talk about conflict resolution, it's not an attempt to make conflicts disappear. They're part of human communities. What we mean is that we try to find ways to deal peacefully and constructively with conflict. It is an important topic because conflicts, there are plenty. As you know, there has been a euphoria for the end of history when the Berlin Wall came down. Most famously, Francis Fukuyama then published a book with the name End of History because he believed that now the big conflict, the big divide between the East and the West gone, it would be the end of history in the sense that the big arguments and conflicts about values were a thing of the past, that everyone more or less now agreed that democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and free markets were the recipe to live together. And all that we still had to do was implement those ideas globally. Now, he proved very wrong in a very sad way, because since the end of the Cold War, we don't see less conflicts, but a lot more, including violent conflicts. We see a proliferation of ethno-cultural conflicts and civil wars. And the longest and the bloodiest wars and conflicts we witness today are in fact almost exclusively internal wars. So not between states, but within the borders of one and the same states. We see a rising tensions between majorities, minorities, often also between centers and remote and bordering territories of the same state. And we see an increase of federalism as an instrument to deal with these conflicts, to manage them, to transform them. And that's going to be the topic of this afternoon. I would like to start with a few maps. As you can see, we currently have armed conflicts on all the continents of the world, with some very painful hotspots that you see here, characterized by the red.
I'm sorry, Professor, but we can only see the beginning of the
I can't.
The title slide.
Thank you for letting me know. So it's still this one. It's still the first slide.
Yeah.
Yes, it's federalism.
So I will then change to presenters view and see what happens. So still nothing happening.
No, no. Still see the beautiful first slide.
Okay, it's not, okay. Let's see what I can do about this. Stop sharing the screen and share it again, or what would be?
Yeah, try so.
Still nothing happening.
No, no, it's a fix.
Perhaps you could attempt the old school system of removing the screen share and then activating it again.
Yeah, it's a very good idea, but for the time being, I don't even find the screen share.
No, it's probably up. If you go up, then it should appear.
I can click on it. It's show tabs.
I don't know if I can do something here.
Still not bad, and still nothing happening.
No.
Should I then just send it to you,
yeah,
Jens,
let's try.
and you share
Please.
it?
Yeah, let's try.
Now you still see my mailbox?
Yeah.
Okay. But you also can see that I can't even, everything seems to be blocked now.
Yeah, it looks really like, but I cannot even, I don't think that I can take it away here. Let's see.
So it should be sent to you.
Okay. Not yet. So I'm sorry for this, but we will try to. So we are trying to solve this. It will take a moment, please.
Yeah, I'm extremely sorry. It's not that we haven't tested it, but it seemed to work 5-10 minutes ago.
So I didn't receive it yet. Now, okay.
Did you receive it?
Yep, I'm trying to open it. Okay, let's see. Maybe we can do it. Okay. So now it should work.
Yeah.
Sorry for the delay.
Perfect. I apologize for this. So now, Jens, you will have to click.
Yes, I will try to do so.
I have talked about the introduction, and now I wanted to show the next map.
Yeah, here's the map.
Yeah, here is the map showing us that sadly there are violent conflicts on all the continents of the world, and we don't seem to be improving in settling and solving these conflicts. And if we go to the next slide, this reminds us that it is by far not a problem of the countries of the South, because northern countries are, most of them, involved in conflict somewhere abroad. So in a way, it's a world war, but composed of small ethno-cultural conflicts happening all over the place. If you go to the next slide, Jens. I always like to compare different maps. This is the one trying to measure state fragility or state stability. And what I find striking is that it is almost the same map. And we don't obviously know what comes first and what is the consequence of the other, but there is a deep and clear interlinkage or correlation between conflict and state fragility. And state fragility leads us to the next map, which is again a map, the Human Development Index, which is again a map which is made by the use of a large number of different, sometimes controversial indicators. So it's three very different maps produced by different NGOs, but they come up with the very same picture, which tells us that where there is conflict, there is state fragility and there is a very low Human Development Index. So there is an interconnectedness, because where there is conflict, there is not just the blood toll on the battlefield, but it affects the entire society. It has a negative effect on service delivery, education, health system, personal security, and development. So obviously we can try to tackle the issue from various angles and perspectives, from the human rights, the development, or the conflict resolution angle. So ours will be to look at the conflict resolution angle. I personally think that is the first step. Peace and security is the first step on which you can build. And the reports on the performance in the field of the Sustainable Development Goals seems to confirm that impression, where the latest report would say how much progress has been made when it comes to access to water and education, and the final summary says, but most of it has not been sustainable. It has been built and it has been lost within a year or 2 years, and mostly due to conflict and state fragility. So that would, for me, be the argument to give great priority to the topic of this afternoon. Now, Jens, I would go to the next slide, to the overview. So I don't know whether you have studied federalism until now. I was not sure, so I will briefly introduce the term and the concept. We will have a look at federalism as an important tool of conflict resolution, discuss some arguments for and against federalizing a country, and then, and that has been discussed with Jens, I will talk about Iraq, which is a surprising choice because it is a country where federalism has failed as an instrument of conflict resolution. And we want to figure out why this happened. My argument will be that federalism has not failed in Iraq, but it has not been tried yet. And at the end, time permitting, we'll have a brief look at Syria and then hopefully enter into discussion. Now, federalism on the next slide. If you have discussed federalism before, you probably know that it is a controversial term, that everyone and every country understands it differently. I refer to it in the very broad sense, in the broadest sense possible. So many scholars would call that not federalism, but federal systems. So this goes way beyond the established or classic federations like the United States, Switzerland, my own country, Germany, Australia, Canada, and India, and so on. I refer to federalism to talk about all states or even systems which have put in place some form of division of powers, division of competencies between at least two tiers of government, usually a central government and a subnational regional government. But very often we would find more sophisticated systems of division of powers, including at least 3, sometimes 4, or even 5 tiers of government. This division of power is entrenched in a constitution. If it's strongly entrenched in a constitution, that would be a characterizing element for a federation. But these divisions of powers are often established by law, so made by parliament, not by the constitution maker, with the advantage of being more flexible, with the disadvantage of being more flexible. Whatever you have agreed upon can be changed by a new incoming parliament. More and more often, we would see divisions of powers which have been agreed upon in a peace treaty, or even have been imposed on a country by a peace treaty. What else would characterize a federal system? There is some level of autonomy for both or all tiers. So the national, the central tier has room of maneuver, political space to make policies, to adopt laws, and so does the subnational tier. They can act in some areas independently of each other, with the one not in need of the approval of the other. Within these general characteristics, we find tremendous diversity, and that's probably the beauty of federal systems. You can have exclusive competences given to the center or to the region or province or state, whatever you call it. But I think we would more and more often see concurrent competences, where both or all 3 actors are active in the same policy field, where, for instance, the national tier would issue framework legislation or establish minimum standards binding for all the subnational units. Such a system can be symmetric, where the division of power regime applies to the entire territory, where the entire territory is divided into regions or provinces, or it can be slightly or highly asymmetric. Highly asymmetric would be that most of the country is unitary, but there is a special regime for one region, an island, or a remote area mostly populated by a minority group, for instance. Another element of a federal system would be that there is participation of subnational units at the center. Now, in a classic federation, that would be a second chamber of parliament, where the territorial units are represented symmetrically or asymmetrically. So the same number of delegates for each region, irrespective of its size, or a slightly differentiated representation. But beyond that traditional way of allowing for the participation of subnational units, a lot of other instruments have come up, usually called intergovernmental relations, based on mutual duties of information, duties of consultation, the right of provinces to be heard and listened to and be taken serious, horizontal cooperation in the form of conferences, interprovincial bodies, and so on. So this is all about making clear that the division of power is not about dividing the country or the regions, it is as much about bringing them together and having mechanisms forcing them to compromise, to reach consensus and to compromise. In addition, we would always find some sort of division of resources. It can be by giving ownership of natural resources to the subnational units. It can be about the distribution of taxing powers, or it can be based on transfers, horizontal or vertical, so grants coming typically from the center and often in a federal system not being earmarked, so that the subnational unit can use it in order to live or to bring its autonomy to life. There would always be, and that's one of the major points, some mechanism to solve conflict. Now, again, if you think of a classic federation, it would be a federal Supreme Court or a constitutional court. And in most federal systems, such a neutral arbiter, a judiciary, would play an important role. But most federal systems have a number of other mechanisms to solve conflict, mostly through dialogue and negotiations, sometimes even giving veto powers to one of the actors, or more democratic means or more consent-based means of conflict resolution. For instance, in Ethiopia, it would be the second chamber, where all the peoples and nationalities are represented. That is the body in charge of interpreting the constitution and adjudicating constitutional conflicts. Or in my country, if we have a conflict that we cannot solve, we would usually opt for a referendum and just vote about it. So federal systems is a broad term, a broad notion. It can cover all sorts of cooperation. And I would say what really makes them be part of one system is an idea of subsidiarity. The idea that the state should be brought closer to the people, that the state should not only exist in the capital, where all the decisions are taken, but decision-making powers should be decentralized or remain non-centralized and be done where people live, unless a task is overburdening a political unit, then you move it up to the next level. Subsidiarity is a main characteristic, and the other would be the culture of compromise. It's not the majority that does necessarily win. Federal systems are counter-majoritarian, that it's not a majority of 50+1 which can rule the country. But we have different majorities and different minorities depending on where you are in the country. You can start to play with numbers, and none of the actors can start to behave in an arbitrary way. We have a lot of checks and balances, not only in the Montesquieu sense on the horizontal level, but on the vertical level as well. Maybe you have studied all of this. I simply wasn't sure and I decided to come back to it. But you raise questions or comments at any moment. Otherwise, we would move to the motives for power sharing. Yeah, that was perfect. Why would so many countries in the world decide to federalize or decentralize? And that is, in fact, the global trend. It's difficult to say how many federations we have, and it's much more difficult to say how many federal systems we have. But we can try to do the other way around. How many countries do we still have where all decisions are being taken at the center and apply in a uniform way for the entire population and the entire territory? What country would that be? I can't see you, but if anyone has good examples, please just mention them. Do we still have countries where the capital is taking all the decisions for the entire country?
North Korea.
Yeah, North Korea, I think, is a good example. Probably not in reality, but in theory and in the legal system, yes. I think North Korea would be an example. Do we have another example?
Ireland.
Ireland?
Yes.
Was that Ireland?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Ireland is still pretty homogeneous. Yeah, you're right.
I have a question. Like, I didn't understand, but it's like if there's a unitary country like Turkey, like because we don't have any regional system, but we have municipalities.
Yep.
So there is some kind of autonomy, but it's a unitary system. Can we consider like Turkey, like countries like Turkey under this?
So thank you for this. Yeah, I mean, if we stick to the classic categories, no. But you're right to say that I have, in my presentation, totally given up on the classic categories, where we would have federations and unitary states. And unitary states could then be deconcentrated or decentralized. In my understanding of a federal system, Turkey would clearly be a system with a power sharing arrangement. Not really a subnational tier, but local autonomy, some diversity for minorities, or some accommodation of minorities. So yes, clearly, even a unitary state like China, unitary according to its constitution, has a number of tools of federalism in place, like an autonomy regime for cities, Hong Kong, Macau, some decentralization to autonomous provinces. So a complex system, obviously orchestrated from the center, but with leaving quite some space of maneuvers for some of the actors. Think of France, for instance.
France has been suggested in the chat, yeah, also as a unitary system.
France, exactly, used to be the prime example of a unitary state with everything decided in Paris, but that is long gone by. France has strongly regionalized its system, and we see quite some pressure to go even further in France as well. So yeah, it clearly is a global phenomenon to decentralize power, to have more complicated system to rule more complicated societies. So if we have a look at the motives for power sharing, oh yeah, I see now the chat. France maybe, yeah, France used to be the prime example, but I don't think it's a longer true. But when the Philippines, when President Duterte was elected as president of the Philippines, if you remember, he was campaigning with two promises. One was to kill the drug dealers, basically, and the other was to federalize the country. So when he was elected, he must have given an order to all his ambassadors in federations to go and talk to people. So the ambassadors of the Philippines several times came to the Institute of Federalism, and once he said, yeah, we have decided to federalize the Philippines, and we have decided on a very narrow time frame. We have given ourselves 6 months, and we know that there are lots of options and models from which we can pick and choose. So we have decided to, as a first step, decide on the model we want to use, and we have decided to take France. And I was a bit surprised to say, if you want to federalize, why would France be a model? And I think they have changed. I know they have changed their opinion in the meantime, but apparently France is not seen as a very uniform country if you look at it from very far away. So good. Motives for power sharing. Why would it be such a global trend? I think it has to do with the fact that, as we have seen on the map, most states are quite unstable. If you remember the map, the very dark green states, where can you find them? Mostly in Western Europe and Northern America and Australia. It's more or less the states who have invented the Westphalian state in the first place. They then have exported it to the entire globe, but at most places it doesn't seem to work very well. I mean, I think that is extremely concerning. Imagine you have a cooking recipe. You give it to 10 people. 8 of the people who use it get sick. You should start to doubt the recipe. So the export of the nation state, that idea that we should have a match between people and borders and politics, has proved to be extremely harmful for many places. Being charged with the task of building up and stabilizing a state within usually very entirely arbitrary borders. So for a long time, we talked about failed states or inexisting states, referring to states which only operate at the capital and have never been able to control their entire territory and population. Well, then the more recent approach would say, maybe we cannot see the state as it operates in many places of the world, because we only see what we are looking for. And these are basically Western institutions. If we open up our lenses, we see a lot of state functions being taken care of locally. In villages, in valleys, it's not failed state. Most things are being taken care of. So it is the idea that decentralization could help to build states bottom up and not from the center, to start from what we have and to strengthen and adopt the mechanisms, usually traditional or old mechanisms, and make them compatible with, so have channels of communication, shared rule between those structures and the more modern capital. It is also seen as a mechanism to deepen democracy, because if we see democracy as that minimum of organizing elections every 4 years, we know that that is not what we would like to see in a democratic system. So decentralizing and bringing the state closer to the people can be a mechanism to deepen democracy. It can be a path to democratization of the entire state. Because if you have democracy locally, you can be much more inclusive. You can include women, for instance, minorities, and a lot of people who do not go for a number of reasons for national campaigns, which cannot or do not want to move to the capital in case they should be elected. So if we have local and regional councils, we manage to be a lot more representative. And we also manage to improve accountability, because what most people have experienced so far is that the state is not really existing. it is not here to build a street or to pay for the teacher's salary. And if the state shows up in your valley or village, it's usually to get fees or taxes out of you. And this money disappears into the capital and you don't know what is happening to it. Then you cannot interfere when the money is lost on its way, because you simply lack information. But if you have very local decision-making bodies and bodies with taxing powers, accountability can much more easily be increased. I have once seen this happening in the newest states, South Sudan, in the very early phases, where each local community had a specific amount of money to spend, and there was a local community coming together and discussing whether the money should be used to build a bridge or to build a school. And there were two boxes on the table. On one, there was a picture of a bridge, and on the other one, a picture of the school, because most people could not read and write. And then you would vote. And when you vote for the school and you know the budget, you get very angry if then the school is not being built. So it can be a mechanism to improve accountability. It's one of the reasons why big actors like the World Bank have included decentralization as being part of a good governance program. You can use power sharing to improve government and development, and also to unburden the center, which does no longer have to do micromanagement. It can be such a good thing that you can agree to disagree. You don't have to agree on everything. You can disagree on religion, language, and culture and still be together as a country. That can help you to preserve diversity. Good, I think we have to move on. I have just had checked the time and I think I have to speed up a little bit. So federalism and conflict resolution. That brings us back to the introduction. Most of our conflicts are fought within states. We also know that most of these conflicts are not decided on the battlefield. They're not solved militarily, they're solved by negotiations, by sitting at a table. Now, when you sit at the negotiation table, you usually have at least one party to the conflict which wants better access to power, political power, representation, and resources. So in most of these negotiations, power sharing, federalism in the broad sense, is at the table. Most often, at least one of the parties is only willing to talk peace if these power sharing requests are being addressed. It's also called tackling the root causes of the conflict and not just agreeing on a ceasefire. So peace talks today are increasingly intertwined with constitution-making processes. In the early times, we would first have a ceasefire, then have elections, and then go for a new constitution. That is no longer how it happens in most conflict zones. You start with constitutional talks at the very beginning, and only when you have agreed on basic principles, you can hope for conflicts to go down. You can expect minority groups to give up arms and weapons when they know they have reached their most fundamental aim. And then you go for a final, an interim constitution, and only based on this interim constitution, you go for election and maybe for a permanent constitution. I have some examples on the next slide of countries where this has happened, where this has been discussed, where this has failed. We'll not go through the list, but maybe use it as an inspiration for the discussion and the question and answers. Jens?
Yeah.
Seeing the time constraints, I think I will skip a few slides and immediately go to Iraq.
Okay.
If that is fine with you.
Yeah.
We can still come back to some of these points if we need them during our discussions. So as you have seen, there is a lot of popularity to use federalism as an instrument to solve conflict. I have been at a number of negotiations where actors have said, you know, to mediators, we don't want federalism. Do you have anything else? And I know that famous mediator would say, no, it's the only option we have. But within the option, you have hundreds of possibilities. But there is little hope to come out of an ethno-cultural conflict without addressing the issue of power sharing. And because so many people would then say, but look at Iraq. Look at where Iraq is today. So don't offer us federalism. It is not a recipe for peace. It is a recipe for the perpetuation of conflict. Because I have heard that so many times, I want to use the rest of my time to present the example of Iraq. As you know, next slide. Next slide.
Yeah.
The map, yes. We cannot say that federalism has achieved or managed to bring peace to Iraq. To most places of the country, you cannot travel, which is also a way to say you would not want to live there because there is violence. So Iraq, the next slide, is a very diverse country. You probably know that, so we will immediately go to the next slide. Iraq has decided to become a federation after the intervention of the United States and the Allied forces. That has been one of the effects of September 11, that the United States has invaded Iraq, brought down Saddam Hussein, and then was in a bit of a problem because the reasons for the war, like Saddam Hussein is connected to Al-Qaeda and to September 11, there were no proofs for that. The second argument for the war, that there were prohibited weapons in Iraq, there were also no proof for that. So the Allied forces were in a bit of a trouble to justify the war. And the solution on which the Allies, mostly the United States, could agree to say, in fact, the reason why we are here is to bring democracy to Iraq and to make Iraq a shining example of democracy and human rights in the entire region. So if you look at the constitutional text, it is beautiful. If you read it, you would immediately want to move to Iraq. Democracy is mentioned about 30 or 40 times in the constitutional text, and the human rights catalog is impressive. It includes free university education and everything most people still wish for. But the constitution-making process has been extremely controversial. I don't know if you, Jens, have been a member of the International Associations of Center for Federal Studies already in 2003, where an email from the United States administration has been sent to the association to say, we have just invaded Iraq, now we look for someone to write a federal constitution, would you be interested? And the big members of that academic institution, like people you probably know, Ronald Watts, John Kincaid, they're answering to say, oh, of course not. That is no way how you can draft a new constitution. That should be a national process. So they all refused. And then the mandate was given to a law firm in New York, which made the first draft, which then went into a 10 people's committee of people, all of them nominated and appointed by the Bush administration. From there was an interim's constitution made still under the auspices of the United States as the occupying power. And only then there were elections and a final constitution being made, but the final constitution still very much looked like the first drafts. So a beautiful constitutional text, but on the next slide, a constitutional practice which has very little to do with it. First, the elections probably have come in too early, with a very unstable security situation in the country and a lot of boycotts. Basically all the Sunni, which is a very important population group of Iraq, boycotted the election for one reason or for several reasons, but one reason being that the Sunni as a group were somehow blamed for the atrocities of the Saddam Hussein regime. They were all thrown out of the administration and out of the army, and as a group felt disenfranchised by the new state. Human rights, not really, if you look at the constitutional practice. It's a sign that it's easy to draft the tremendous human rights catalog, which has not even been discussed by the Constitutional Assembly, and it has not been able to change the situation on the ground. The more federal issues were that there is only one region in Iraq, only the region of Kurdistan, and there are no other territories. So if that is a federal state, it is a very bizarre federal state, to say the least. It only has one unit, and the rest of Iraq still is a unitary state. The constitution said that, well, we recognize Kurdistan as a region, and all the other governorates can transform into autonomous regions. Some of them have attempted to do so, but the parliament, the national parliament, refused to even discuss their demands. So even now, 15 years later, there is still only one region. And that region itself is very unstable because most of its territory is disputed territory. Only about 1/3 of the territory is uncontroversial, the rest is disputed territory. So there is one unit, but we don't know what its territory is. So autonomy cannot really operate in such a situation. Another difficulty is that most of the competencies are concurrent. So Baghdad and Erbil both can legislate. And the Iraqi constitution has a surprising rule. In case of conflict, the subnational regional rule prevails. That obviously is good for Kurdistan at first sight, but it is absolutely harmful for the unity of the country. In addition, there is a constitutional rule to say that Kurdistan must have its own constitution. It has so much power, it's quasi-independent, so it must have a system to constrain that power, to constitutionalize that power, and that has not happened. So that very far-reaching autonomy or quasi-independence is given to a region which itself is not ruled by law. Then there is an absence of a second chamber, and I think that is a major shortcoming of the constitution-making process in Iraq, because the constitution says, it's a federal constitution, so it says the national parliament is composed of two chambers. One is representing all Iraq, the other one is representing the regions. And then the constitution says that the first chamber must establish the second chamber. So during the first election, only the first chamber of parliament was established, started to operate. But if you think of it, why would the first chamber representing the majority of the country, which in this case is a Shia majority, why would you then establish a second chamber limiting your powers? Well, you would not. And until today, that second chamber does not exist. So the regions, that is Kurdistan, has no institutional place, no institutional representation in Baghdad, thus has no interest to even go to Baghdad. Politicians in Kurdistan have no interest in pursuing a national career because there is no place where they could find themselves. The constitution also says that there is a constitutional court working as an arbitrator for conflicts between Baghdad and the regions, doing abstract and concrete review. But the constitutional court has not been established until very recently. So all the conflicts between the one region and the rest of Iraq cannot be solved by a neutral judiciary. So in the absence of such a neutral adjudicator, what do you do? What do you do to win a conflict? Obviously, you use your elbows. And if your elbows are not strong enough, what else would you do? You try to find alliances across the border. So you include your neighbors like Iran or other actors. Another shortcoming of the constitution in Iraq is that the entire system depends on oil resources. More than 95% of the state income comes out of oil resources, and the constitution does not say anything meaningful about it. It says oil resources are owned by all Iraqis and all the regions of the state, and basically should be shared fairly. Obviously, that obliges all the conflicts into political channels, because there is no legal instrument, and that vagueness of the constitution cannot be solved by the institutions, because the institutions are not set up. There is only one chamber and it's clearly majoritarian. So if we look at the shortcomings of the constitution making process of 2005, that's the next slide, Jens. It is a direct result of American intervention. The American advisors have played a key role. Most people would say it's an example of imposed federalism, federalism not being chosen by the local elites or the local population, which I think is true. Federalism at its core is a fetus, it's a covenant, it's an agreement. It's an agreement between actors to share power. And such agreement is missing in Iraq because the Kurds did not really have to negotiate, because they could refer to pre-intervention promises. Before the United States had interfered militarily in Iraq, there was a meeting between Bush administration and the Kurds in London, and the Bush administration promised the Kurdish population autonomy for their region if they would support the military operation on the ground and not use the power vacuum to go for independence. So that was a pre-intervention promises. So the Kurds did not really have to go and negotiate. They could just rely on the promise. The third important group would have been the Sunni, but they were first excluded from the process and then in a way excluded themselves by boycotting the elections. So at the end, there was only the Shia majority left. What we see as a constitutional practice is an almost exclusively majoritarian system run by one chamber of parliament. So a lot of things have been gone wrong during the process and when we look at the outcome. There was not enough time. I think that's one of the lessons. You need time to negotiate. There was pressure in the United States to agree on the constitution within a limited, I think it was about 5 months. That time pressure came from the outside because elections were coming up in the United States then. And the Bush administration wanted to bring home an Iraqi constitution like a trophy to say, see, this war has been very effective. So there was time pressure which was imposed on the country. At the same time, there was little pressure to compromise. No one forced the three major groups to go and sit together at the negotiation table and agree on a second chamber, agree on the composition of a constitutional court, and agree on ways of how to share natural resources such as oil. So as a result of that, and that's the last picture slide on Iraq, Saddam Hussein has been brought down. There is a new constitution, but there is definitely not a federal constitution. So my counter argument to those who would say federalism has failed in Iraq would be to say the peace process has failed in Iraq. Federalism has not been tried yet. So what can we take from this for Syria? Next slide, Jens, a map of Syria. Syria is the immediate neighbor of Iraq, characterized by a population which has a lot of resemblance to the population of Iraq. In particular, it also has an important Kurdish minority in the north of the country. So is federalism a mechanism to solve conflict in Syria? And that would be my last slide. We don't know, but I hope to discuss it with you. There is little agreement on anything when it comes to Syria after so many years of horrible civil war. The main guiding framework is still the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, which is one of the few resolutions the United Nations, with all the veto powers involved, managed to agree upon. And it basically says that the way to peace must be a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned process. So no imposing of federalism as it has been done in Iraq. And it also says that the way to a political solution and to election must go via a new constitution. So there is a step-by-step approach which says first a new constitution and then elections. I don't know whether this has been a good plan. It was in a way also learning a lesson from Iraq to say if you have elections before you have agreement on the future institutions, it's kind of hard to have reasonable elections. So first we need to have the new constitution and the new institutions, and then we go for election. The disadvantage obviously is one that we see now. As long as there is no new constitution, there are no elections. So Assad and the regime has a very profound and personal interest to delay the making of a new constitution, because that is delaying elections. Currently, we have several peace or constitution making processes going on. The Geneva process, led by or mediated by the United Nations, the Astana process orchestrated in Moscow, and a number of alternative processes which have come up out of frustration that the official processes are stuck. If we look at the current situation now, is that the Geneva process has started roughly a year ago, based on an agreement between geopolitical powers. Now, I think that the agreement is highly problematic and does not give much hope for a rapid resolution of the conflict, because the Geneva formula is 50-50-50. So 50 members of that constitution making body supposed to draft a new constitution in Geneva. So 50 of the members are nominated by the regime. 50 members are nominated by the opposition, and 15 members are nominated by the United Nations, but both sides must agree to these 50 members. So you can imagine that has taken the process about 3 years. So a lot of time was wasted because it was just not possible to agree on these 50 members. And as a result, basically 25% are close to the opposition, and 25 of these members are associated with the regime. Because after 8-9 years of civil war, it was not possible to find a neutral people acceptable to both sides. Now, these 150 members and a small committee composed of 45 are supposed to come up with a constitution. There is a draft for a federal constitution, and there is also an agreement of the opposition that there should be at least enhanced decentralization. So the future of Syria looks decentral or even federal. But the reason why I'm not very optimistic about the next step is that the guidelines say that the constitution must be adopted by a 2/3 majority. And if you look at the numbers and the composition, you can see that it's impossible to adopt a new constitution without considerable number of votes coming from the regime. Now, you could try to convince members of the regime that federalism is the way forward, or enhanced decentralization is the way forward, but any representative of the regime who would listen to that or change its view would immediately be replaced by the regime. So I think it is a peace process which is very sadly stuck. And I think I would like to stop here so that we have time to discuss Syria or Iraq or any other situation of conflict resolution or failed attempts or successful attempts to solve conflict by using federalism. Thank you, Jens, for showing the slides.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eva Maria. Thank you. This was very thought-provoking, the two examples in particular of Iraq and Syria, and also to see them together. I wish you would have ended with a more optimistic view, but probably it's also due to the cases that this is not possible. But we have now time, half an hour, for discussing these two cases, but also other issues which have been raised during the conference or which you would like to know. So I would like to maybe collect some 2 or 3 questions. Please also use the chat. And there is already a first question, which is here by Mario. Can federalism strengthen secessionist tendencies in states with cultural and ethnical homogeneous areas?
Mm-hmm.
Then there is another one by Sylvia asking, would you consider the use of federalism in Bosnia as a successful example? So
Mm-hmm.
Bosnia. And there's a second question. So basically we already have 3. Considering that in many countries, international actors such as the EU, UN, or NATO play an important role in the introduction of federal institution mechanisms, what is the best way to ensure the inclusion of local actors in the process?
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. I'll start with the first. How does federalism, the introduction of federalism, relate to secessionism? Well, often it is a result of secessionist movements. It is an attempt to accommodate secessionist movements. If we leave aside the old federations, which have come together through aggregation, through the union of formerly independent units, all other federations used to be unitary state, and at some point in history federalized or decentralized or introduced an autonomy regime, never out of a free will, but almost always pressured by secessionist or separatist movements. So that, I think, is the main point. It is a mechanism to preserve the territorial unity of a country in the presence of strong secessionist movements. Because if you look at most secessionist movements, most started in a very moderate way. They wanted autonomy, they asked for the right to speak and teach their own regional language. And only when this capital refused to discuss these issues, the moderate voices started to be silenced and more extreme voices started to take over. You can see that all over, including in Catalonia. When you refuse to talk and have a dialogue, you trigger such dynamic that more extremist demands pop up. So I would say the opposite. It is the best way to deal with secessionist movements. And I would say from my experience and from what I've read, usually that solves the issue. Very few groups or regions or communities would just say, we want a state. Most would say, we want the end of marginalization. We would like to have the right to equality. We would like to have our culture protected. And if a state manages to guarantee that, why would you want to go for a state? But many people associate federalism as a first way, as a first step to the disintegration of the state. That persists as an idea in most places, but we have very little evidence. If we look at the countries which have gone through secession in the past, it has always been unitary states. No functioning federation has ever suffered a secession. So I think the opposite is true. But I can understand the fear that once you have missed the opportunity to react early, when you have an extreme secessionist movement that wants to go for a state, then federalizing can be scary, and it can be that it comes in too late. That those in power only see this as a chance to build up all the institutions and international relations they need to go for independence. So I think that conflict can, when conflict has been escalating for decades, then I think it can be true. Good. The Bosnia question, I think
maybe
that is...
sorry for interrupting, I just feed in something from the chat here. There
Yep.
is a comment, the United States is a good example of this, especially since it's so large and yet does not have any significant secessionist sentiment among its subject states. So this was
thank you very much. Thank you very much. The United States is a good example. My country is a good example. I mean, why would Switzerland even exist? It does not have any national unity. And outsiders would say, why wouldn't Ticino want to be part of Italy? Why would not Geneva want to belong to France?
But there are also the Soviet Union, there is the former Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, there is Ethiopia, but then let's talk about Bosnia. I just wanted to...
No, I mean, you're right. But would you say that the Soviet Union was a functional federal system?
This is the question, exactly. Yeah, of course.
Probably not. And I think Ethiopia does not so much have a federal issue, but a human rights issue.
Yeah.
Lack of equality. Good. Bosnia-Herzegovina, I think your professor Jens Wolk is the expert, has just returned from Bosnia-Herzegovina, but you're right to mention it. I mean, those studying imposed federalism usually mention Iraq and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I mean, Bosnia-Herzegovina is definitely an extreme example where the constitution is not a national constitution, but it's part of a peace agreement. It's Annex 4 or 5. It's signed by international powers. So that is a very unique way of federalizing a country. Now, has it been successful? I don't think when you look at Bosnia, you would immediately say it's a success story, but that is a question of what indicators you would use. The violence issue has been solved, and that is a tremendous success. And a number of other issues have been solved. Is there a federal spirit? Is there trust? Probably not, but those issues will take a lot of time in most places. And if you manage to have institutions which somehow manage to operate and take decisions and implement decisions, that is a great success. I had a small debate with a man you surely know, Michael Burgess, with his famous book on the federal spirit. At one of the early meetings with the Syrian constitution making bodies, which then were not nominated, let's say politicians from Syria, he was there and he said, well, if you lack a federal spirit and the atmosphere of trust, don't even try to go for federalism. And I profoundly disagree with that idea, because in all conflicts, I mean, that's basically a definition of conflict. All trust is lost. So then the question is where you start from. Do you first need trust in order to federalize? So where does that trust come from? I personally believe that you first federalize. You have all these institutions of information and consultation and these fora of cooperation where people have to sit together and find consensus. And that is the best chance we have, that after a while, some trust is being built up. So that would be my answer. And I think Jens Wolk will probably complement me. What is the role of international actors and how do they ensure that the process is national and inclusive. I think for some time, there was a very negative approach to foreign involvement. Very national or nationalistic feelings about constitution-making processes, considering foreign involvement a problem or bad. And I think we have moved beyond that and have a greater interest in saying, if you're an outsider, how can you interfere in a useful way? I think in many conflict situations, international actors must interfere and should get involved. And they are the best chance we have that there is a fair process. Even in Syria, I think the international community has already played an important role to say, you know, you have to nominate women. You cannot make a constitution with 150 men sitting in the committee. And I don't think the regime or the opposition would have nominated any female representatives if not being forced. And if you think of situations like the Kurds, you represent less than 20% of the population, 15, 18, depending on who you listen to. How can you be part of the negotiation process and trust it if you do not have any strong international actor guaranteeing fair rules? Look at Sri Lanka. If the Tamils are less than 20%, how could they trust the constitution-making process if the constitution is adopted by a 2/3 majority? They can sit at the table, but they know from the beginning that their voice doesn't count. So I think we should not look at international actors versus national actors, but at now international actors helping to give voice to all the national actors. Obviously, they should not be the one making the constitution, but they could be or should be involved in the design of the process. And I think some actors have really learned a lot of how they can do that.
But Eva Maria, if I may jump in here.
Yes, please do.
And then there are other questions in the chat, but I just want to follow up here. But is this reality what you are saying, or is this wishful thinking in order to provoke a bit, in the sense that Bosnia, Iraq for sure, also Kosovo, maybe Syria, which is still in a way not finished as a process, are all processes where we see rather imposition by the international community than a true involvement. And of course, this is a failure. But do we have examples where this kind of more successful and more, how could you say, promoting, mediating role of the international community could be seen?
Starting from the example of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, federalism was imposed on Germany by the Allied powers. The basic law was signed by the Allied powers, and federalism was a mandatory ingredient of the federal constitution. And the foreign powers also imposed the fact that federalism would be covered by the eternity clause. So it was given to Germany to stay. I think similar things can be said for the Japanese constitution. A lot of foreign involvement, but I think most constitution, I think the Swiss constitution, we should not think that the Germans, France and Italian neighbors did not show an interest in the negotiation. Most minorities have kinship partners across the borders, and the same goes for Syria. It is a geopolitical conflict, and it's almost a lie to say only Syrians should be sit at the table, because the Russians and the Turkey, they should be there because they are part of the conflict. Now, is it wishful thinking that international actors play this role of ensuring inclusiveness? Yeah, maybe in part it is. Because you have to make very tough compromises. Because when you have, after a long violent conflict, and you go for peace negotiations, you cannot entirely choose your partners at the table, because all actors able to spoil the process must be there, no matter whether you like them or not. I have been at these meetings where large groups are sitting at the negotiation table would never look at me or shake my hand because I'm a woman, but they must be there because they represent an entire part of the population. And the more violence you have, the stronger is the pressure to have all, I mean, if you have weapons, you get to sit at the table. That's the short formula. So obviously there is a tremendous risk that other groups are not represented. But for a peace treaty, that's the first interest you have. You need to make peace between those able to go to war.
And this is obviously also the main difference, I would dare to say, apart from the historical period with regard to Germany and Japan, because there it was a clear unconditional surrender, and the reconstruction and federalism, in a way, in the German case, was the way of keeping the state together. And it was also in a way, I wouldn't say maybe in the DNA, but there were historical precedents also which you could build upon. I would maybe we can come back to these cases, but I'd like to share two more questions here. Basically, it's one and then three questions in one. So first one is by Elena. Can external pressure, understood as the risk of external attack, be one of the factors triggering federal processes? So a kind of defense as a motivation for forming a federation. And then by Eyüp-Can, thank you, Professor Belzer. I have a couple of questions. First, in the case of Turkey, federalization seems more difficult in terms of changing the constitution. What do you think about a milder regionalization, but keeping the constitution unitary instead of strong changes? The second one, federalization seems like a political settlement rather than some kind of peace resolution. Can it be achieved simultaneously? So political settlement and peace resolution? And the third sub-question, I studied this from Gérard Marcoux mostly, but do you think federalization has a strong connotation in comparison to regionalization?
Okay, the first question has been
on the external pressure and defense as a motivation for triggering.
Yes,
federalism.
Absolutely. I think, if you have power, it's not a natural thing to share it. Most people in power want more, not less. So dividing power is definitely not a natural thing to happen. I think it always happens under pressure. So that pressure can be internal pressure. That's the secessionist movements we've been discussing. Or it can be external pressure, that other countries express some appetite for some of your territories. I have only recently discovered that my own country recognizing Romansh as a national language. It's a language spoken by 0.5% of the population. I always knew that it has happened in the 1930s, but I have only recently discovered that it happened as a consequence of a speech given by Mussolini, saying that the Romansh speaker naturally were belonging to Italy and would be much better off if they would belong to Italy. So that foreign threat, or perceived as a threat, triggered that idea to say, hey, no way, they belong to us. And we must make sure that they are happy within our territory so that they do not get in touch with Mussolini and neighboring Italy. So yes, I think that is a main factor. And I have recently read an interesting book trying to find out why European states were so stable compared to African states. And the argument was to say that Europe has been characterized by hundreds of years of wars about borders. And if you do not want to fight about your borders all the time, you must make sure that your population likes you. And in particular, the bordering regions, because these are the regions you are most likely to lose. So many European states would have a lot of infrastructure, traffic and schools and infrastructure in the bordering regions. They have overinvested in the bordering regions because that was still cheaper than defending these borders, even against your own people all the time. While during the decolonization process in Africa, but in Asia as well, there was an agreement on nothing but on one thing: don't touch the borders. So as a newly independent state, local elite taking over, you have no interest in your remote areas. The best and safest thing for you is to sit in the capital and make friends with your former colonial powers. Make sure you get invited to the European capitals and so on. But don't travel in your country. And the situation is aggravated by the fact that most of these local elites were actually representatives of minority groups. Why would that be? Because they were the natural allies of the colonial powers. If you're a colonial power and you want to exploit the colony, you don't necessarily want to do that on your own. I mean, it's hot and dangerous. There are all sorts of diseases. You don't want to go and do the job. So you need local partners. And who is your choice? Obviously, it's an ethnic minority, because that group will then entirely depend on you. So you have the local elite, the minority group, they travel to Paris and Brussels and you become good friends. And these people take over when the colonial powers leave. Now they have no interest in the region. They even fear their own regions. And for obvious reasons, they fear democracy, because they know that if the country would have free and fair election, they would be out. And not only would they be out of power, there would be revenge. So in most of these former colonies, we would see a state concentrated in the capital, organizing fake elections every 4 years, because there are simply no incentives to go and develop your areas and to organize free and fair elections.
If Maria, may I just, there's another question. Afterwards, we have the Turkey regionalization question, I would say, because I would fit in here another question which comes up in the chat, and which is indirectly related to what you just said. Taking up your argument, federalism, decentralization deepens democracy and enhances representation and accountability. How to deal with the argument that federalism, decentralization multiplies corruption, cronies' influence across levels of government? Because this is a major problem in conflicts and in democratizing areas and after conflict. So this is in a way directly linked to what you just said.
Good. I mean, when I say federalism is a good tool to solve conflicts, it's obviously not a panacea. If you have pre-existing deficiencies in your state, like corruption, the state as the only real employer, no culture of paying taxes, or no tradition of transparency and open government, all these issues will not disappear when you decentralize. Obviously, you then will decentralize all these state weaknesses and deficiencies. That I fully agree. But I think we have ample evidence that it is still the best chance to start to fight corruption and to strengthen the state. If it's not only because if you have corruption close by, you can more easily control it. We have a recent honorary doctor of our faculty. It's Raghunandan from India, and he has become famous for fighting corruption. And he has mostly done so by setting up an internet website, just trying to bring in transparency into corruption. You know, Rubik, how much did you pay for your driver lessons? Where? In what region, what community? So that you have some price control. It was so effective that the website was run over. And locally, it was more easily for people to complain. Say, why should I pay 60 rupee? I know exactly that before me, someone has only paid 40. So it sounds stupid, but it has helped a lot to say, look, I'm talking to you. I'm paying your salary with my taxes. Now give me that license. What Raghunandan also says is that the key is local taxes. Not just to say there is no taxation without representation, but the other way around. There is no representation without taxation. If you want to govern, you have to tax. Mm-hmm. So you have to knock at the door of your population to say, we need a new school. Would you please help me pay? So you have to do that very unattractive job of asking your citizen to pay. Because once they had to open their pockets and pay, they get very angry when then the governor is driving it around with a BMW. So it is obviously a very long and complicated process, but I don't think that corruption is an argument against federalism. Mm-hmm. The Turkey question, obviously, Turkey, as like many countries, will not use the term federalism in the constitution in a long time. And that doesn't matter at all. So many countries hate the label federalism and would do all sorts of power sharing arrangements or accommodate minorities, but would insist on not being federal. And that's perfectly all right. Like South Africa, I say, we are not using the term because it's associated with homelands approaches. We don't want it. But we use decentralization, or like in Kenya or Great Britain, you use devolution, or you use regionalization. So no matter. Sri Lanka had an interesting plan. Everyone in Sri Lanka would hate the term federalism. I was sent on a mission when there was a discussion about the new constitution, and I had all these briefing meetings with embassies, and they said, you know, whatever you do, don't ever mention federalism as a term. They will throw you out of any audience room where you are. And said, you know, it's going to be extremely difficult. How should I even introduce myself to say I'm from the Institute of Beep? So we had a lot of laughter about it. But it's a fact that federalism is seen as the end of Sri Lanka. But what the plan was then to say, let's go for devolution and have a second chamber. And have an Article 1 to say Sri Lanka is a unitary country. Well, that is perfectly all right. As a constitution maker, you do whatever works. The relation between federalism and regionalism, well, I think that is really an open and controversial question in scholarship. Most people would tend to say it is an intermediate way between being unitary and being a federation. So somewhere on the gray scale in the middle, I'm not sure whether I agree. I tend to think that some regional systems are even stronger than federations. typically very asymmetric, typically given autonomy to pre-existing units with strong regional identity, and quite often giving veto powers to these regions. So when you have a lot of bilateral negotiation, it's even stronger than federalism, because in a federal system, a unit can be overruled by other units. In many regional systems, look at Italy, Bozen, Bolzano, or look at Canada, Quebec, which I think is almost regional as a system. It is even stronger than federalism. It adds confederal elements, so requirements of unanimity. So I would tend to say, let's throw regionalism into the toolbox of federalism and just open up, broaden the options we have. Maybe when we negotiate, we need to give veto power to a specific region, maybe the Tamil regions in the future, because when you have been overruled so many times, when you feel that you end up as a permanent loser, maybe then you need to add a regional or confederal touch to that.
Okay. Sorry for, but I have to now unfortunately close the session, because we have already arrived at 4 o'clock. I have a number of questions here which I cannot ask, but I'm very happy that there was discussion from the floor, and I think this was a very good and very interesting discussion. I have just for thanking you, I have two main issues or main elements I would take from this afternoon, and one was, which I very much liked when you talked about Syria, there's little agreement on anything. If this is the situation, then of course it is also difficult with federalism, probably, because, and this is related also to some answers you gave during the discussion, we need of course something to build upon. If there's nothing, if there isn't anything, then of course everything is very, very difficult. And unfortunately, this is the situation probably in Syria, but also to some extent Iraq and other countries where we see rubbles, literally, and it's very, very difficult to build up.
Yeah.
But
I mean, sorry, Jens, Jashka, you know, that's always the first question when he enters mediation.
Sorry,
Are you a state?
Yeah.
Does Somalia exist? Sometimes there is even disagreement on that.
And this is exactly the second element I would take from this afternoon. Thank you. So we are really very much in tune here, because I was very much impressed when you said that there is a bias versus Western institutions. Now, when you talked about Westphalian and exactly the state issue, no? And but on the other hand, you opened up to a very optimistic view, which is a pragmatic view. On the other hand, it's not only optimistic, which is that at local level there is very often governance, and there is something you can build and you can start from. And this bottom-up approach, I think it's of course always nice to say, but probably it's also the only way to start things which are then really sustainable. But very often it is not by imposing a constitution according to Western models, which unfortunately is often the way it is done. And these are the two things which very much struck me, and I think which you really taught us well. And thank you so much. Thank you for our participants in engaging in discussion, in following me. At some point we were over 100 participants, which is quite an achievement. I wish you a nice afternoon, and I hope that we can welcome Eva Maria Belzer another time at our School of International Studies. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you very much, Jens. Thank you to all the audience. Sorry, I was not able to answer all the questions. Okay, hope to see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Okay. If you want to wait a moment, if you still have 5 minutes or 2 minutes, and we leave, you can use this connection.